down in Dunedin, there was the 1985 sort of Cavaliers tour, but also there'd been a tour of New Zealand by the Springboks. This tour of the All Blacks to South Africa that was derailed in the Cavaliers. So Dunedin Corso became the centre of all radical activity because the trade unions were sort of doing nothing, and peace action in Eden was along the road, but we had all this big meeting space and stuff like that in Corso, so people would make banners and do all that sort of stuff. And so then we had an arson. Someone tried to burn the Corso building down. It was just a kid looking for money, but it was really freaky because we thought it was the rugby boys. And we were also involved at that stage in the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific, which was
Suzanne.
challenging the peace movement about racism and colonialism in the Pacific and in Aotearoa. And it was taking into the Māori and Pacific communities the whole issue of the nuclearisation and military in the Pacific, because they weren't thinking about those things. You know what Māori are like, it's just like what's happening in the hapu and the whānau, and not really aware of all these other things that are impacting on the Pacific. So that was really exciting. That was amazing, a lot of activists. By the time I was doing international stuff with that movement, nearly all the activists were the indigenous ones, whereas it had started off as Fijians from the University of South Pacific and lots of white activists from America and Australia and New Zealand, peace activists. So when it became an NFIP rather than just an NFP movement, that's when all the indigenous activists started,
What does the I stand for?
Independent. So Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific. So it was about ending colonisation. Because at one of the, I think it was the hui where the name was changed, maybe in Hawaii, Hilda Haukia Harawira challenged them and said, and they were in a group in Auckland called PNAC, Pacific People's Anti-Nuclear Action Committee. And so she was a New Zealand delegate, and she said, we've already had the nuclear bomb here. That was colonisation. And that was a big shock to all these white activists from the Pacific Rim, and also to the Filipinos. They weren't too keen about, they just wanted to get rid of military bases and stuff like that. So they were sort of a bit resistant to Aboriginal Australians and Native Alaskans, Native Americans, Māoris, Canucks, Native Tahitians. They were really pushing the anti-colonisation, anti-nuclearisation and militarisation thing. So the NFIP movement was amazingly formative in terms of building those relationships through the Pacific and having, just really conscientising and giving lots of opportunities for people from Aotearoa to travel to the UN and places like that. And I remember at one UN meeting, it was an NGO meeting, and I was on a platform with a Palestinian woman. The only reason I was there was because we got funding for 3 women from Dunedin to go to the UN. It was myself and Mary Laufiso and a Māori woman called Narissa Tapatu. And so they put me on the panel. I think the other 2 were too chicken, and they made me, I was the older one, you see. So they made me sit on this panel with a Canuck man who was a trade unionist. He was part of the movement, and a Palestinian woman. And it was really an interesting forum because there were some white Americans there who were complaining about, this guy was complaining about something. And I said, excuse me, do you realise that sitting on this panel is a man who just lost 19 whānau because the French had these young men holed up in a cave in Uvea in Kanaki, New Caledonia, and basically they shot them, they managed to capture them, and then they took them in big nets and dropped them from a helicopter into shark-infested water. This had just happened like within a month. And this old was moaning about some stupid thing. So anyway, all the white women from America sorted him out, but also I remember really enjoying telling the woman from Palestine that that the people in your movement in New Zealand who are supporting Palestine don't support Māori. And she was really shocked. And I used to tell everybody, I met internationally, whether they come from Nicaragua, from South Africa, from anywhere, look, the people who are supporting you do not support tangata whenua. And the only story that used to go internationally was from these white solidarity people. And the story of Māori was never being told. So Corso was really important. And we supported people like Moana Jackson to go to Geneva to work on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, because the ones who were going, like the government supported Māori, but they were from Māori Affairs. And I remember getting this call from one day saying, I need money to go to Geneva. I just had a call from a colleague, a Native American colleague, Ward Churchill, who was in Geneva, and he rang me and he said, brother, you've got to come over here. These Māoris are killing us. Because the Māori bureaucrats had been sent by the New Zealand government to undermine the workings of the Indigenous Working Group. And the ones who were the worst governments there were Chile, Peru and New Zealand. They were doing everything they could to undermine that working group. So because we were looking at what was happening here and bringing that into the Pacific work it was based in Dunedin, in Corso's work, we were able to support that kind of travel by Māori to actually go and tell their own story in these forums, because they just had no way of going. Then there was another women's group in Auckland. It was really good. It was quite well-off middle-class women like Charmaine Pountney, who was the principal of Auckland Girls Grammar, and women in the peace movement and stuff like that. And they put together a women's fund to fund Māori women travelling overseas to tell that story, or tell their stories of colonisation, of the treaty, and all the stuff that had happened here. So that's been it really. That was. Corso was just so important, Yeah. Yeah. It's just been the foundation of everything else, So we had our nuclear free and independent Pacific group in Dunedin called Te Whanau Matariki. That by 1990, there were a couple of things had happened. One was there were about 3 of Te Whanau Matariki left in the city, and we'd been a group of about 15. And we're like, everyone was running away. They had all this personal stuff they couldn't deal with. And so they were either drinking or drugging or just taking off. And so I was saying, how do we become sustainable? Dunedin's notorious for, being transient anyway, because you've got all these students who want to get radical and then they leave and you got another lot. But these were Dunedin people. How do we actually sustain our struggle when everyone just leaves or just gets, out of it all the time? And so we started looking at, Marie and I started looking at why, well, first of all, also to say this, I said there was 2 things. There was that. There was the other thing was that a lot of treaty work had been happening, and anti-racism work had been happening in the 80s. And yet we couldn't see any real change in terms of Pākehā people. They were still stuck in their guilt or their pain or their angst of some kind, or they're angry because all their myths were being destroyed. So we started to why are Pākehā the way we are? What has made us this way? And so we started looking at the effect of colonisation on Pākehā. Because we were continually talking about what's happened to Indigenous people and what's happened to Māori and blah, 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 and these are all the gains that Pākehā have made and these are all the losses Māoris have had. But then when we started looking at it, it was like, Pākehā people got the same losses, just happened in a different place. And there's a different history behind that loss. And so obviously that's the paralysis comes from all that mumai that's been shoved deep down that you don't talk about. You're not allowed to talk about being, sad or whatever, or that you've got these losses because you're so privileged living in Aotearoa and benefiting from colonisation and stuff, And I'm quite clear that I'm really glad colonisation happened for me, because I would not be here in terms of all my bloodlines that met and, that whole history. I'd hate to have been born in 20th century Caribbean or Africa or England, any of those other places. I'm so fortunate to have been born here in the 20th century, in terms of women's stories. So I know what the privileges that I've accrued, but it doesn't answer the fact that the loss of language, the loss of whānau, the loss of your land, the loss of knowing who you are, the loss of your stories, all those things are what make Kiwis, Pākehās want to all be the same Kiwis, because, they don't know anything. They just don't know nothing. And so so we started exploring that and trying to work out how do we support Pākehā to do this learning, to actually say you have to know where you came from. Even if it's hard, you have to know where you came from. So that was the basis of our colonisation work. Is we looked at that historical stuff, but we also looked at what it does to your mind and what it does to how you see yourself, and how you see yourself in the world.
We still don't talk about that stuff. We're
No.
talking about the Irish Catholics amongst us, that we have forgotten that we were colonised by the English.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
They took our land and our language.
The English did it to the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish. They practiced on all those peoples before they went out and did it to all the other native peoples around the world. That's how come they are so skilled at it.
Yeah.
And and I just, in our workshops, I say, we're from the people that Britain didn't want. They think they became Great Britain because they were so good. I had this discussion, so I know I'm veering away.
No, that's okay.
I had this discussion at Waitangi this year. Hey?
This is what we do, veer away.
Oh, good. I had this discussion with a young guy from Radio New Zealand up at Waitangi, you see, and I was saying something because I've been speaking on the panel with Don Brash. And
can we go back to that after?
Anyway, that's my phone.
I watched Alice Sneddon again last night. I've got to repost that.
Oh,
Alice Sneddon interviewing Don Brash.
Oh, that would be hilariously funny. That would
not
be
using Te Reo.
Yeah.
He doesn't know any Te Reo.
Oh, he opened his speech with Te Reo Waitangi. But anyway, I'll go into that in a minute. But anyway, this young guy at the gate, he'd been in England. He'd been working in London probably for 2 or 3 years at the Press Gallery in the House of Commons. And I don't know how it came up, but I was being smart-mouthed, and I said, I'm really looking forward to Brexit because they're in the shit. I've got great friends. And I said, look, the people in Britain don't understand that they were only great because of the colonies they were able to steal from. They sold the land, they stole the resources, they enslaved the people. That's what made them great. Oh, no. What about their poets? And I just said, what about their poets? That's right. Like Shakespeare was able to conquer the world.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, what about all the Persian poets? What about all the Pacific poets? What about the French, the Germans, the Spaniards? All these people had amazing poets, but they didn't do what the British did. It's just like blow my mind. And so I told that story the other day in Auckland about this guy who works for Radio New Zealand thought that Britain was great. It's great because it had good poets. And when I do workshops and I talk about colonisation and slavery being the drivers of capitalism, that if it hadn't been for those two things, capitalism would not have survived. Right. And I show that the stately homes of England, they were all built with either the proceeds of slavery or the proceeds of the compensation that the slave owners were paid. Like something, I think in today's money is like £28 billion was the money that was paid in compensation when the slave trade had to end. And the slave owners in the Caribbean and in North America were paid out for the loss of property.
By whom?
By the British government, the British taxpayer.
And
probably using money that they'd made off the slave trade.
Yeah.
And so you've got
That's
these
amazing.
So every time I look at anything on British TV, and the same in the French and German as well, all those chateaus and stuff, that all came from the colonies, from slavery. So it's those kind of things that you have to keep talking. That's my phone.
That's okay.
Sorry. Kia ora. Kia ora. Who's that? Oh, T5, how are you? I'm just in a radio station.
We love you.
They're all clapping. I'm recording a podcast and they're going to be editing it out, but they're just laughing because I've just been talking about how I became an activist and your name came up.
That's spooky.
That's okay.
So perfect.
If anyone can interrupt you, we'll...
Oh, yeah, about just the way that colonisation has affected not only the minds of people that we colonised, but also us as well.
Yeah, of course.
So that rightness of whiteness is something that we just accept as normal. It's not even something that's disputed in terms of, our place in the world. If it's right, if it's white, it must be right. And everything else is, well, that's interesting, or that's, how exotic, and they're such interesting people. They got, that kind of stuff, but we're normal. And so it's about challenging our own people to unpack that stuff and to stop listening to the one story. Because if you only listen to one story, it becomes the story.
That's right.
There is no other truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the big challenge, the decolonisation of the mind. And that's something, that whole perspective was something that I first heard from Māori women, from Rebecca Evans and Hilda Helkyard. They're the ones who were talking about colonised minds and how, we don't know who our heroes are. They're all these English heroes, the people that we think are the heroes, and we've got to reclaim our own heroes and blah, blah, blah.
I know, and so I was talking to someone the other day, because we talk about this quite a bit, Irene, when in our writing for university writing, that perpetuating the same Western authors and keeping that narrative alive.
Yeah.
And I was talking to someone the other day because I was reading the Hun Report.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, because someone said, go back to the original. I was reading that, and it had some figures from 1959, and it said 92% of Māori lived in the North Island and 79% were in Auckland. And this was in a book, and I thought, okay, this is what the whole policies were built on. And then I talked to a lovely friend in the Māori Centre, and she goes, well, I was around in 1960 and there were more Māori. And
We were easier to overlook.
and also, if you look at the census that's just gone, and they've missed over 400,000 people.
And Māori were notorious for not doing the census.
No,
right
I
from
know.
the beginning of the census collection.
But again,
About how the census was, how they took their information.
Yep.
So the old school census didn't have, you could only claim one culture.
Yes, that's
Yes.
right. That's right. And you wanted to claim white. There was a lot of reward for claiming your white side. That's,
Right.
it was like when I was growing up too, that there were Māori around, but very few of them would have said that that's who they were. But also, there was so much suspicion as well in terms of what are the Pākehā going to do with this stuff. Absolutely, absolutely. I think the thing that started to maybe... the Second World War, I think, had a lot to do with dealing with some of the suspicion in terms of, because Api Ranangata had been the Minister of Native Affairs, and he had told everybody, if you go to fight, it's the rights of citizenship and all that sort of stuff. And so the men had gone off to do that, and they believed that. And some of them also fought alongside Pākehā. So there were those kind of connections and relationships built, which meant that some of that real suspicion that had come out of the land wars and loss of all that sort of stuff, because of the relationships they built with individuals, that started to be damped down a little bit. But here in the South Island, it was like everyone was marrying Pākehā. I remember my mate that I work with now, Moana, who's based in Christchurch, she's really dark for Ngāi Tahu, because her father was from Kahununu. But her mother, you'd pass her in the street and not know that she was Ngāi Tahu at all. And so she and her family looked very Māori, as opposed to most of their relations who were really, really fair. And you wouldn't know. They would have just ticked New Zealand European or something. There was no space for iwi or anything like that in those old census. So, so it's... that the fact that you're bringing up those figures, that's amazing, because they're so inaccurate.
yeah.
God.
In the language, anyway, that was a
Wow.
tiring day.
Once it's written down and it's a government
It's
document,
truth.
it's truth, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
and it perpetuates.
yeah.
Since 1769.
And see, Michael King in his Penguin History of New Zealand, which is quite recent compared to some of the other histories,
Yeah.
he talks about He Waka Pūtanga as being an instrument that was designed by the missionaries and Busby. And he says basically that they got the chiefs to sign the declaration of Rangatira, he calls it independence, but it's actually about sovereignty. And they did that because the missionaries were concerned about the French. Well, that was true. All the Pākehās were concerned about the French. But the chiefs had a whole different narrative that they told to the tribunal. And they corrected Busby's wording and all this sort of stuff. And yet that story had been hidden, only talked about within Hapu in the north, until that information was given to the tribunal. And it was really clear that those men and women knew exactly what they wanted. They knew exactly that they wanted to actually develop and enhance the relationships they already had with the British. So they called the document he waka putanga o te rangatiratanga o New Tirini, not of Aotearoa or Te Waipounimu, but of New Tirini, which is saying to the outside world, this is the place you call New Zealand, and we're in charge here. You know, it wasn't just someone talking to the guy next door saying, oh, you know, hello, let's do this together. This is saying, we're talking to you guys, and you call this place New Zealand, so this is what the story is. You know, but anyone who reads Michael King's book, because he's got a lot of mana, will believe that this seminal document, which is, the treaty's only an instrument of that document, that was just something that the missionaries dreamed up, and, you know, irrelevant, doesn't have to be taught in New Zealand history, because, you know, it was just something the missionaries did for a short while.
It's really easy to sink into the soft cushions of believing that we weren't particularly sophisticated in our governance or our
world experience.
Our communism.
I know. Judith Binney and Salmond, they're two that have broken that mould, in that they go right back to the people all the time. But there's a quote I just saw the other day. I can't remember the whole quote, but it was about one of the early governors, or one of someone anyway, who said, like, to civilize these people, talking about Māori, we first have to teach them greed.
Yes,
because
I saw that.
they share everything.
It's
They
so
share
true.
everything. So
Yep.
if we are to civilise them, we must first teach them greed. And it's like
There's
that.
no going back from it either.
No.
Once that virus is in there.
It's right. And then they talked about, you know, the beastly communism, having to destroy the beastly communism that was so much part of the Māori world. And this is governors and stuff that were here, and it's just like mind-blowing kind of stuff, really. But people don't know that they don't want to know this stuff, but they need to know, you know, because Māori are not going to stand back and just wait to be given stuff anymore.
That's a good segue onto where we are sort of now.
Yeah.
And we can revisit your Waitangi Day story in a minute. Here at Ōtepoti, where do you think, well, or the whole of New Zealand, where do you think we are at the moment?
In terms of, as a nation, as Pākehā, Tauiwi and Māori together, I think it's difficult in Dunedin.
A different microclimate?
It is.
Yeah.
It is different. In lots of ways, there's less antagonism, but there's also less relationship in a real sense.
Like transparency, do you think of?
Yeah,
Or,
and I think that I see my learning. Most of my learning has come through kahunu or ngāpui. Even though I have worked with Ngai Tahu, but basically they are my teachers, and working with Ngai Tahu has come late. And we came through NFIP with Rānu Parata and those ones, and now with Moana o Hinerangi. But I find that my first working with Māori was working with Māori who were working pan-tribally and pan-Pacific. And that's where my passion is, in terms of moving us forward as a people rather than just in a local thing.
So, speak more about that.
I think because of working to decolonise my mind, I understand the reason to go back and rebuild hapu and whānau and hapu. I really get that. And so when in Freedom Roadworks, which came out of the NFIP movement, after we'd done a lot of learning and politicisation and decolonisation with our families and stuff, we decided we had to start to work in our own community. So the Māori ones would work with their Māori community, and the Pacific Island ones went back to theirs. And so my work with Pākehā was to do the treaty work with Pākehā. That's the focus for me and for my whānau. And so, but I know that we're only going to be victorious when we come back together. And we have to be able to come back together and sit at the table and look at each other and say, I will do this, I won't do that. You know, I think everyone has to know what their bottom line is, what they are prepared to compromise in order to build a just, peaceful place, and what they can't compromise on. So that talking has never happened. But I think Māori are still in that building phase of, so are Pākehā. We haven't even got together to sit down and say, what will we do as people? Because we don't even want to be called people. We want to be called individuals. But, so Māori in that building stage of rebuilding their mana and their rangatiratanga and their status in their own minds as well as in the general thing. My passion is in the rebuilding stage, in trying to actually bring Pākehā people together, and also, I suppose, hoping for the day when Māori will also want to work cross-hapu and cross iwi, not just it's stuck in their own thing.
Yeah.
Because the model that they're using is not a model I support in terms of capitalism. And I remember when Ngāi Tahu had their settlement, there was a lot of dissension from various parts of the iwi about the corporatisation of the iwi. And the other things that have concerned me, because my two passions are uplifting the mana of women and honouring the Treaty of Waitangi. And I see how Ngāi Tahu women have also been sidelined because of the corporate structure. And those queer and whaia have to be able to take their place again and say what it looks like, because the women are the ones who will hold the land. And the women are the ones who are the cradle of the culture.
Whenua ki te whenua.
Yeah. And that's where you learn what it is to be Māori or to be Ngāi Tahu or whatever, through your mother. And so those women, something's got to give within the iwi corporate thing. I don't know how it's going to happen.
For more latest people.